Hey everybody, and welcome to my two-handed weapons dueling tier list for Chivalry 2. We're going to go and do one-handed weapons in another video, but anyways, let's get right into it. First weapon here is going to be the longsword. Now the longsword is an extremely fast weapon, but it doesn't do a lot of damage, and it doesn't exert a lot of pressure on the opponent. And you're going to hear me say the word pressure a lot in this video because it's a very important thing in dueling. When you're dueling somebody, you want to be able to deal a lot of stamina damage because that's what you're going to be trying to do as a main strategy in a lot of duels. You want to be able to pressure somebody and break their stamina so that they can't react to your counter feints and your feint to heavies. That being said, the longsword is very fast and it can compete with a lot of the one-handed weapons, which does give it some points. When you're using the longsword, your main strategy is going to be sneaking in blows where you can, and unfortunately you're not going to have a lot of stamina pressure, so you're going to want to sneak through gambles wherever possible. You're going to want to focus on stabs and excelled overheads and excelled slashes. You're really not going to have very many opportunities to do really heavy feints with this weapon because it's just too fast to really do the heavy drags that you're going to want to do. All in all though, the longsword is a pretty good weapon, and if you specialize in it, you can do some really crazy things with it. So we're going to be giving the longsword B tier. You can very easily do well with this weapon. It's very fast, and with the attack cancels and excels, you can trick up a lot of people, but it's just not a top tier dueling weapon. All right, next up we have the war axe. The war axe is one of my personal favorites. It has a very good counter window, so you can counter, very well. It also has very solid excels and extremely good drags. There's really not much wrong with this weapon. The reason that I'm not going to give it like an S tier is probably just because there is a better axe, and that's going to be the battle axe for duels. The battle axe does put on more pressure than the war axe, but the war axe has much better drags than the battle axe, so they both have their own little strengths. The war axe also has pretty decent range. You can outrange people very well with this weapon, and you can't take that for granted. One thing you do have to worry about when using the war axe is not to drag too much. I know it's very tempting when you're using a weapon that has very good drags. You're just going to want to feint like crazy and drag all the time, but you have to watch out for that, because if you drag too much and you're fighting somebody who's not absolutely terrible, they're going to catch on and they're going to start jabbing you like crazy, or they're just going to say, oh, he's just going to drag like crazy, I'm just going to gamble him every time he goes for a drag or a feint. So you have to know how to condition people with a weapon like this. You have to maybe excel 10 times before you go for the heavy drag. And if you don't do that, you're putting yourself in a bad position. But if you play it correctly, there's no reason why you can't do very well with a weapon like this. So I'm going to give the war axe A tier, because if you do learn how to play these two-handed drag heavy weapons correctly, you can do extremely well with these in a competitive setting. You also can't ignore the stamina pressure either for this weapon. I know I said it's not as good as the battle axe, but it still does do extremely good pressure. You're not going to have an issue breaking somebody's stamina, let's just say that. Okay, I think we can move on to the next weapon now, and that weapon is going to be the heavy mace. Now, if you've been following the channel for a while, you know that the heavy mace is probably my overall favorite weapon. I used it for the better part of a year almost exclusively, reaching top 200 in the world with it. Probably a little lower now because I've moved on to other weapons, but still, this weapon is extremely good. There's no way to cut it. It's the one downside with this weapon is it's just boring to watch a duel with it, because it's just back and forth, back and forth. You have so much stamina because you get a 20% buff to your stamina. It's almost like you have a built-in shield when you're using this weapon. Not only that, but it has both very strong excels, and it has good drags, and it has a good stab. It's very rare in this game that you get a weapon that has a triple threat like that. It has everything going for it, and the one thing that's bad about it is it's just very boring to watch. I'm trying to think really hard about something that is negative about this weapon, but I'm having a really hard time actually. I mean, if you're a good player, there's no reason why you wouldn't learn the heavy mace. It's so good, in fact, that if you use nothing but the heavy mace, then you're crutching yourself. And that's what I realized, and that's why I got off of it, because I was using it as a crutch to make myself better at the game. So I wouldn't recommend only using the heavy mace, because I think you should use every weapon and learn how to use everything. But in terms of just dueling potential, the heavy mace is S tier. It's one of the best in the game. All right, let's move on. Next we have the poleaxe. The poleaxe is another one of my favorite weapons, and it's pretty easy to see why. It also gets the stamina negation buff that the heavy mace gets. A couple of weapons get it, but the strength of the poleaxe is that it has very good distancing and ranging. So you can do a lot of very good stuff with the stabs and the overheads, and it has a crazy special attack that looks just like an overhead, except for it has insane range. So you can catch people off guard very well with that. I'd say the one negative thing about this weapon is that it has a very short slash. So you're going to be focusing a lot on the overheads and stabs, but the short slash actually has an unintended benefit. When you have very short slashes like that, it allows you to be hyper aggressive. So I'm going to be giving the poleaxe A tier for its versatility. It's one of the more versatile two-handed weapons in the game. You can be aggressive with it, you can be passive with it. It's just all around very good. But who needs versatility when you have pure pressure? The next weapon is the battle axe. This is the weapon I think of when I think of the word stamina damage. This thing can 3-shot your stamina bar with heavy attacks. When you're able to do such a high amount of stamina damage, it makes conditioning your opponent very easy, because after only 2 heavy attacks on their stamina bar, they're already trying to counter your next move to be able to save the rest of their stamina. And that's the main thing with conditioning. When they're low stamina, they need to counter. And if they need to counter, then they're going to go for the first thing that you throw, and then you switch it up and throw a heavy feint. And that's the reason that the battle axe is just so good. Yeah, it doesn't have as good of drags as the war axe, but its drags are good enough. And the excels are really what you're going to want to focus on with this weapon anyways. I would say that the battle axe is pretty much the competitor to the heavy mace. It's a pretty good matchup, and you're seeing that on the screen right here. If you're going for a stamina war, you're going to want to either pick the battle axe or the heavy mace. So for obvious reasons, the battle axe is also going to be receiving S tier. While we wait for this duel to finish up, because I do want you guys to see the matchup between the battle axe and heavy mace, I do just want to say this video took a lot of work. I had to go into a duel server and duel with every single weapon for at least 3 duels just so I had enough footage to do this video. So if you appreciate that, drop me a subscription or like the video, comment, and let me know what you guys think of this. And with that, let's get back to the tier list. Next up, we have the War Club. Now this one is kind of interesting. It's like a heavy mace, but it has the speed and damage of something that's more like a longsword, but it also has the range of a polearm. So it's a very interesting weapon, but interesting doesn't necessarily mean good. Now it has a lot of gambling potential, and it has a lot of spacing potential, but it has pretty poor damage. So your enemy is going to have a lot of time to react to what you're doing and kind of play around it. You're not going to be putting on a ton of pressure with this weapon, but you might not need to, because if you're fighting someone who's not very good, then you can just kind of pick them away from a distance. And you kind of use the classic Vanguard strategy with this weapon a lot of the time, where you swing, you back up, you dash, you try to get away from them. Now there's kind of a secret category of weapon that I want to bring up here, and that is the weapon that is not very good, but if you're a good player and you use this weapon a lot, you can become extremely proficient in it, and nobody will know how to deal with you. Now, that doesn't mean the weapon is good in general. There is that subclass of weapons that you can do extremely well with if you spend a lot of time on them, and that's one of these weapons. Calling out Pax KC here, he's a War Club expert, but there are so very few of them that I can't rightfully give this weapon a very good high tier. So I'm going to be giving this C tier. Okay, next up we have the Executioner's Axe, and this weapon actually has a lot going for it. I like to think of this weapon as the more accessible Highland sword. It has something that we haven't really discussed yet, and that is very good light drags. And what a light drag basically is it's a drag that you don't hold your button down for and turn it into a heavy. And you're going to want to use that to switch it up a little bit. You know, you're going to want to alternate between light drags and excels with this weapon, because there is one big negative here, and that is that you are very susceptible to getting jabbed with this weapon. So if you go for heavies or feints, you're just going to get jabbed out and you're not going to be able to do anything. This weapon also has very good pressure, very good stamina damage. So if you're switching up correctly between excels and light drags, they're not going to be able to counter everything. They're going to take damage to their stamina bar. And you're going to want to then maybe switch it over to a heavy swing after you've conditioned them enough and gotten their stamina very low. And you're probably going to get plenty of damage in just from the light drags themselves, because they're very hard to read. This weapon has pretty good swing and manipulation as well, just because it's such a drag crazy weapon. You're seeing on the screen here, a lot of these duels, I'm just getting in free hits because they can't react to the light drags, and you're going to really want to abuse that with this weapon. It's very strong, but it does have that one disadvantage of just being very susceptible to getting jabbed a lot. So I can't really give it S tier because it has a lot of locking out issues, where if the enemy is good at controlling the flow of the battle, you're going to have a lot of issues. So I'm going to be giving this one A tier. Next up, we have the Great Sword. Now, the Great Sword is a great sword. No, but the Great Sword has pretty much everything going for it. The one thing it might not have is the stamina negation perk that maybe the heavy mace or the poleaxe has. But what it does have is good pressure, good damage, good swing manipulation. All of its attacks are pretty solid. It's got good spacing. It's got long range, you know? Good light drags, good excels. It's got so much going for it that it obviously just needs to go in S tier. I've seen some of the best players do crazy things with this weapon. I'm talking to you, Snake Case. I gotta duel you soon, man. But I mean, it's a crazy weapon. You wouldn't think it because it looks so simple, but with just a simple overhead, you can completely stop people from approaching you. With the light drags, you can keep them guessing. And with the excels, you can drain their stamina and do a crazy amount of damage. One thing in particular that I like about this weapon is the double overhead toe drag. It seems like such a specific thing, but when you do a double overhead and you move to the left of them, you can do that little toe drag that you just saw on screen right there. And it's such an effective overhead that not many of the other weapons really get. So, like I said before, this weapon is getting S tier. It's very versatile. It has pretty much no weaknesses. Yeah, that's about it. Okay, next we have the Maul. I'm going to do something a little special for you bonk enthusiasts out there. And I am going to review this weapon with the internal monologue of anybody who uses a Maul. Alright, you ready?
Me use Maul. Me do lot of damage to stamina bar. But me really slow. I get jabbed a lot and I get gambled. Maul not very good weapon. Me no care. Me bonk. Me give Maul D tier on tier list.
Back to our regularly scheduled tier list here. Now we have the Highland sword. Guys, the Highland sword. And this is another tech weapon, kind of like the War Club, where if you spend 1,000 hours on it, you too can be unkillable. I'm talking to you, Turks. I hate you with a passion. I hate getting killed by somebody who knows how to use this weapon effectively. It's crazy what people can do with it. If you're going to choose between this and a Maul, you might as well just choose this because it's just a Maul with swing manipulation and range. Why would you choose a Maul when you can choose this weapon? I don't know. But why would you choose this weapon over a greatsword? You also wouldn't. You would just choose the greatsword usually. Like I said though, you can do crazy things with this weapon if you spend a lot of time on it. And then you're just unkillable. But since there are so few specialists that can actually correctly use this weapon, it's gonna have to go into C tier, unfortunately. Similarly to the War Club, but I think this weapon actually does have more potential in a duel than the War Club does, because just the range and the dodging, you can do crazy stamina damage with it. You can break someone's guard in like 3 hits if they don't counter you, and this weapon's extremely hard to counter. but it just has too many weaknesses. Like, you can see I'm just getting gambled when I try to use it. It's probably just because I don't have a lot of practice on it, but why would I have a lot of practice on it? I don't really want to spend 1,000 hours trying to get good with this weapon. But yeah, like I said, it's going to be C tier, guys. All right, and next up we have the Dane axe. This is one that I've been spending so much time on recently, just because it's so solid. It's almost like a slightly less pressuring version of a battle axe, but what it doesn't have in the pressure of the battle axe, it makes up for in the speed. The speed of this weapon is crazy, and you can do very quick feints. Instead of going to a feint to a heavy drag, you're going to want to focus on doing really fast feints that go right into accels to trick them. They're not going to be able to have the time to counter a lot of these moves, and that adds to the pressure of the weapon, where it doesn't have in pure damage, it makes up for in just the utter inability to counter it with how fast it is. This is another weapon where if you're fighting something like a heavy mace, it's a very good counter pick. And at the end of the day, that's all a really competitive duel is. You have to counter pick what your opponent is using. So the Dane axe is a very good counter pick against a weapon like the heavy mace, and it's very good counter pick against a weapon like the battle axe. It's just such a fast weapon and so hard to counter that you're just gonna instantly get a lot of riposte. Now, it does have a pretty weak stab, but you can really look around that because the overheads and slashes are just so good. And it doesn't have terrible drags either. It doesn't have as good of a drag as like a battle axe or any of those other types of axes, but it's good enough to trick people. So we're going to be giving the Dane axe S tier. It's just too good for duels. It's good for everything. Top tier weapon for sure. Next up on the tier list, we have the Messer. Now, the Messer is one of the best weapons in the game for straight up swing manipulation. It also has extremely high damaging overheads, and it has a stab that is comparable to a longsword stab. Actually, even though it's a little bit slower than a longsword stab, it has the range over the longsword stab, so it's better, in my opinion, for a duel. So you can do a lot of crazy swing manipulations with the overheads and the slashes, and a lot of the times when you're fighting somebody, they're not even going to be able to read what you're doing. You're going to be throwing an overhead, they're going to think it's a slash, they're going to think it's an overhead. And remember what I was saying about that toe drag overhead that you can do with the greatsword? Well, you can do that with the Messer too, and it actually might be a little bit harder to read with the Messer because the animations on the Messer are a little bit more tricky than that of the greatsword. And once you do get the hang of this weapon with all of its weirdness, it's one of the funnest weapons in the game to use. It's fun to watch a duel with it. It's honestly one of my favorite weapons now for duels, for TO, for anything in this game. So I'm going to be giving the Messer S tier as well. It's also a great counter pick for against any weapon. It's so versatile, kind of like a greatsword in a way, but it's just got a little bit more flair than the greatsword in my opinion. It's a lot more fun to use. Next up, we have the two-handed hammer. Now, I like to think of the two-handed hammer as kind of a mix between a heavy mace and a Dane axe, but it has a little bit of the weaknesses of both of those weapons. Let me explain a little bit. The two-handed hammer has kind of similar speed to the Dane axe, and it has a very good combo speed, making it a lot more easy to gamble with the two-handed hammer than it would be to gamble with the heavy mace. But the two-handed hammer has a really bad stab, and it doesn't have very good drags, making it kind of like just like an excelling weapon. So you can excel very well with it, and if people are trying to feint or heavy against you a lot, then you're going to have a lot of success against those people because they're not going to be expecting the gambles, how punishing they are with the two-handed hammer. But that being said, there's not as much potential with conditioning with this weapon. It's a patient player's kind of dream weapon in that you're going to have very long duels with it, but it is a very solid weapon, especially if you're just going for straight up a counter war or just trying to break down their stamina. You're kind of playing the long game with this weapon unless you can get in some cheeky little gambles, which I wouldn't really count on in a high-level duel in getting in those gambles a lot of the time. But yeah, I'm going to give the two-handed hammer a B tier. It's going to be B tier because while it is a solid weapon, it just isn't quite there. It's a blunt weapon, so you're not going to do that much damage against vanguards with it. And while it does have a similar speed to the Dane axe, it's not as fast as a Dane axe, and it also has very short range. So it's worse than the heavy mace in almost every way, and it's pretty one track. Okay, moving on here. Next we have the Glaive. Now this one might catch a lot of people by surprise, but for duels, the Glaive is actually very effective. So let me explain why. This weapon is basically like a longsword, but with a polearm's range. Now it's not as fast as a longsword with the stab, but every other type of attack is way faster than the longsword. Now for TO, this isn't a great weapon because it takes a lot of damage to kill somebody. But you can literally just spam overheads in a duel and you will have an insane amount of success. It's kind of crazy. You wouldn't think it's that great of a weapon. And even I'm still not totally convinced. But I don't even use this weapon ever. And as you're seeing in these clips, I am just destroying people with attack cancels into excels, and all I have to do is spam it. It is a brain dead, easy weapon to use in duels. You can literally keep your distance so easily, and it's very oppressive actually. It's still surprising even to me. But with that being said, it's still not like an S tier weapon, but it's pretty close. I think if it did more damage and added a little bit more stamina pressure, it could possibly be S tier. But we all know Torn Banner's not making any more updates to this game, so we're going to have to stick this weapon on A tier. Alright, next up is the Spear. Now, while this might be the best TO weapon in the game because of the distance you can gain from people, I wouldn't say it's entirely effective in duels. It's actually pretty bad in duels because you have 2 attacks, you have overheads and stabs. Makes it extremely easy to counter people with. And in TO, you can do a thing called jump stabs, which is basically jumping over somebody's repost and then hitting them from a distance and they can't really hit you back or counter you. But in duels, that doesn't really work because jumping takes a lot of stamina. So if you're using a spear in duels the same way you would use it in TO, you're putting yourself at a major disadvantage and you're leaving yourself open to getting disarmed. Which when I duel a spear user is what usually happens. They always get disarmed, because the spear is not a good weapon for stamina management. And when you're in a high level duel, that's one of the main things you need to worry about, is correctly managing your stamina. So unfortunately, the fact that this weapon only has 2 attack types, it's very one-dimensional, and it doesn't have good stamina management, I'm gonna have to put the spear in E tier. And I know I'm using a lot of tiers for this tier list, but I wanted to have a cool little overlay for the video. But yeah, it's pretty bad for duels. Moving on. Next up, we have the pole hammer. And these next couple of weapons, they're basically just worse versions of the heavy mace. Now, for a pole arm, the pole hammer is not very long, so you can't really space people out very well with it. And a while ago, they actually nerfed a big aspect of it that made it good, and that was the handle hit. So now you can't really handle hit anymore, which is basically a fancy way of saying you can excel very fast with it. You can't do that anymore. So it's not very good. You would just usually choose a heavy mace over this weapon. But that being said, I mean, it's not terrible. If you don't want to use a heavy mace, you can still do the same things that you would do with a heavy mace with this weapon. But it's just a worse version of it. So, gonna be real quick with this one. I'm giving it B tier. This video is running a lot longer than I wanted to, so I'm gonna try to finish it up here pretty quickly. Alright guys, on to the next one. Next up is the Quarterstaff. And the Quarterstaff is another worse version of the heavy mace. One interesting thing about it though is you can actually, it's the only special attack in the game that you can actually drag or excel the special attack. It's pretty interesting, but they nerfed this weapon. It used to be actually so OP that they banned it from tournaments, but since they kind of nerfed the stamina negation perk on it, it is just a worse version of a heavy mace. It has a worse stab, and the slashes are just very short, which I guess could be abusable since they're so fast and you're able to combo with them very well. but I just wouldn't take that as it being an insanely good weapon. It has a very solid overhead, which you're going to want to spam whenever you get the chance to, but overall, I would rather choose the pole hammer over this weapon, or I'd rather choose the heavy mace or the two-handed hammer. It's just too short and one-dimensional. You can get outspaced with it very easily. Anybody with a long weapon is going to outrange you, and it's not hard to get outstammed with this weapon either. So this is going to get C tier. Next up, we have the Halberd. Now, the Halberd does have a lot of strengths, so it's not a terrible weapon even though it's a polearm for duels. I would say that the Halberd has very good drags, which makes it viable in duels to an extent. Big weakness of this weapon is that it's just really slow compared to a lot of the other weapons like it. Think of it like a poleaxe, which got A tier, but it's not as aggressive as the poleaxe, which kind of makes me like the poleaxe more. You can be kind of aggressive with it, so it makes it more versatile. With the Halberd, you're going to want to focus a lot more on keeping your ranging and focusing more on the stabs and overheads, with the potential of getting some really nice slash drags and some light drags with those slashes. But still, it's not as strong as the poleaxe, unfortunately, for duels, and you get the footman health as compared to the knight health. All that being said, you can do very well with this weapon. I don't think it's a bad weapon at all. I think that with enough practice with it, you can get those drags and excels down very well. It's a good weapon to practice your spacing with, and I think that overall it is a B tier dueling weapon. Next up, we got the Goedendag. Now, I like to think of this weapon as a mini version of the Maul. So why would you use this over a Maul, which is already a pretty bad weapon? The only thing that's better about this weapon as opposed to the Maul is it has a better stab, which isn't really saying much. It's actually slower than the Maul and shorter than the Maul, which just makes it a pretty horrible weapon for duels in my opinion. Like, I've faced some of the best duelists in the game at this point, and when they pick up a Goedendag, even though they are better than me skill-wise, I still have a much better chance at taking them when they decide to meme on me with this weapon. This is a meme weapon. You do not choose this weapon for a duel unless you are just having some fun joking around. It does do really heavy stamina damage, but it's just so slow. You can't punish anybody for anything. You can't gamble with it, and you can't really even feint with it. If you try to do anything like that, you're going to get gambled. You're going to have a bad time. If you pizza when you're supposed to french fry, you're going to have a bad time. If you use the Goedendag when you're supposed to use a weapon that's fast and does a lot of pressure damage and is very tricky, you're going to have a bad time. This is not the weapon that you choose for dueling. This is the only weapon on this tier list for the two-handed weapons that I'm putting in F tier. And it's very sad because this is the last weapon that is ever going to be released for this game. And they made it terrible for dueling. You can make it work in TO if you're very selective with who you fight. But in duels, you can't really punish anybody. If you disarm them, there's a good chance they're going to have enough time to get their secondary out before you can even punish them for getting their stamina gone. Even when you kick somebody, there's a chance that they can get their guard back up before you hit them. That's how slow this weapon is. It's just way too slow to be effective in duels. Next up, we have the shovel. Now, I was actually kind of surprised at how much damage the stab does for the shovel, but that's pretty much all it has going for it. You know, if you hit a stab on somebody with this weapon, you're going to do like, I don't know, 67 damage just with the stab. And it's also really fast, but it's so short. And if you're going to go for a short, fast weapon, you might as well just switch to a one-hander. And unfortunately, this is on the engineer class. So if you're not careful with your stamina, you're dead. You lose everything, and you have no weapon to defend yourself with. If you're going to go for a weapon like this that has decent damage, decent speed, you would just choose a battle axe or something, or you would just go straight up to a one-handed weapon. So, yeah, you can make it work, but it's just not worth it. Just choose a better weapon. Choose something that has a little bit more range, a little bit more dragging potential, which this does not have. You can't really drag with it. All you have is a weapon that excels pretty well and has a pretty good damage stab. But as you're seeing in these clips, I mean, I get disarmed and I just can't do anything. So the shovel's getting E tier. Alrighty, coming up at the end here, last weapon, and this is going to be the Sledgehammer. So think of it like this. Take the two-handed hammer and make it pocket-sized, and there you have the sledgehammer. Pretty simple concept. Plays almost exactly like a two-handed hammer, but it's just faster than the two-handed hammer. Does similar damage to it as well. So why would you choose this over the two-handed hammer? Answer, you really wouldn't. And yeah, I'm gonna give this one D tier. And remember guys, if you liked this video, this one took a crazy amount of time to make, so please remember to like, subscribe, comment, let me know if you disagree with anything that I said today, and let me know if you agree with anything I said. And with that, thank you guys for watching. If you're still around this long, I really appreciate it. Peace out.